up that piece of skirt who's sitting by your side. Then pop the crucial question, a ride for a ride.
I like truckin', I like truckin', I like truckin', and I like to truck. I like truckin', if you don't like truckin', tough luck.
Okay, it's important for all professional drivers to have a good understanding of driver's hours regulations. There are two sets of driver's hours regulations. There's the EU driver's hours regulations, which relate specifically to periods of work, driving and rest. That's EU regulation 561/2006. Going alongside that, we have the working time directive, which concerns a lot of other people rather than just drivers. If a driver knows and adheres to the EU regulations, he will almost certainly conform with every aspect of the working time directive. There is one important aspect in which they may not, and they may have to be careful, and that will concern your multi-drop driver, which we may discuss later. In terms of the hours then, we're concentrating on EU Directive 561/2006. There is a maximum driving period. That maximum driving period is 9 hours. Driver cannot exceed 9 hours driving in any day. The directive goes on to say that he can extend that to 10 hours twice a week. So it gives you a total driving time, if we're looking at a 6-day working period, of 56 hours. Okay. Clearly for safety reasons, there is a need to restrict the number of hours that a driver can drive off straight, and that restriction has been put in as 4.5 hours. What the regulation says is that after 4.5 hours driving, the driver must take a break, and that break must be of at least 45 minutes. So in simple form, the driver drives for 4.5 hours. He must then stop and take a break, and that break must be of at least 45 minutes. It doesn't often happen in practice. More often the driver will be stopping between times, and a more typical scenario would be where the driver drives for 2 hours and stops at that point where he's able to take a rest, and he'll have a break here of 15 minutes. Now after having that break, he starts driving again. He's already driven for 2 hours, so his maximum now is 2.5 hours. So a driver will drive now for 2.5 hours, and he hits the 4.5 hour maximum allowed. He's already had a 15-minute break. The regulations allow him to split his 45-minute requirement. The first break must be of at least 15 minutes, and it is there. So the second break here must be of at least 30 minutes. Cannot be anything less than that, otherwise he does not have a qualifying break. If the driver happened to have a 30-minute break there, that's the first one, that's perfectly legal, nothing wrong with that, but he will still require to have a 30-minute break back here, because the regulations stipulate that the first break must be of at least 15 minutes. That 30-minute break would qualify for that. And the second break must be of at least 30 minutes. He cannot take the breaks the other way around. Okay. So if we draw a line under that one, the next thing I'd like to consider is the rest periods for a driver. If we look on the break as the short periods of break between driving or other work, and we look upon rest as the long period between two driving duties. That's the easiest way to look at the two different aspects. In terms of rest, the regulation says that a driver may drive for no more than 6 daily driving periods. Now, if a driver did drive for 6 daily driving periods, using his maximum amount of driving each day, he's allowed, if you remember, 2 10-hour driving periods, which equals 20, and then his other 4 periods can be a maximum of 9 hours. 4 9's 36. So the total in any one driving period or any one weekly driving period is 56 hours. We have to remember with this, there's also another regulation which says that it limits the fortnightly driving, and a fortnight is any 2 consecutive weeks, limits the fortnightly driving to 90 hours. So clearly, if our driver has driven for 56 hours on week 1, he cannot drive for 56 hours on week 2. He would be limited then to the difference between 56 and 90, which is 34. That would be his second week's driving. Okay. Now, after that 6 daily driving periods, he must take a weekly rest. So we have a daily rest, and we have a weekly rest, each of which comes in multiple formats. The daily rest can be a regular daily rest, and that regular daily rest is 11 hours. It may be what's termed a reduced rest, and a reduced rest is anything less than 11, but it must be at least 9 hours. And you can, of course, do that 3 times in any week. Okay? There is a third daily rest, and that's called a split daily rest. And a split daily rest is a period of a period of 3 hours, followed by a period of 9 hours. It suits some operations. It's not a common thing that's used, but it does suit certain operations, particularly anything involving regional distribution centres. So those are your daily rests. Looking at weekly rests, again, nothing's easy. Again, this is split into a number of variants. The regular weekly rest is 45 hours. And if you think about this, most drivers would have that because most drivers will finish either on a Friday night or a Saturday midday. So they've got at least 12 hours on the Saturday. They've got a full 24 hours off on the Sunday. That's given them 36 hours, 37 hours, 36 hours. And then, of course, they'll be starting at 7 o'clock in the morning or something of that nature. So we've got in our lower 40s in terms of hours, normally, but not always. We can reduce that 45 hours and have what's called a reduced weekly rest, and our reduced weekly rest is 24 hours. Anything less than 45 hours will count as a reduced weekly rest. Okay, so there's a difference now between a weekly rest and a daily rest, in that if we reduce our weekly rest, we have to compensate. We have to pay back the hours that we had as a reduction. In terms of a daily rest, if we reduce from 11 to 9, end of story, we do not have to compensate or pay back that amount of hours. But with this situation here, we do. So if we take the reduced rest of 24 hours instead of 45, we end up with 21 hours. We have to pay back that 21 hours, and we have to pay back that 21 hours within 3 weeks of the end of the week in which we took the reduction. Now, the 21 hours must be paid back en bloc, in one lump. We cannot pay back 10 hours this week and 11 hours next week. We have to pay back the full 21 hours in one go. The other important thing to remember with this is that this 21 hours has to be added to another daily or weekly rest period of at least 9 hours. So suddenly our 21-hour requirement becomes 30 hours. Okay? But again, with normal driving patterns, this is often taken care of by the weekend, and we've only got a difficulty where the driver does regular weekend working. Okay? So that will complete the daily and weekly rest periods. Okay. Right, we've spoken about a driver having to take his rest within a 24-hour period. That's the 24-hour period when he starts work. So if we take an example where the driver starts work at 7 o'clock in the morning, if he worked his maximum shift, the maximum that he's allowed in the regulations, that allows him a 15-hour duty. If we add 15 hours to 7 a.m., we end up at 10 p.m. Now, this is Thursday, so the driver realises that he's had 3 reduced periods of rest in the week so far, so he knows he's required to take a regular daily rest. That regular daily rest, of course, needs to be 11 hours. Now if we take 11, or if we add 11 hours to 10 o'clock, we end up at 9 a.m. the next morning. And many drivers think they've complied with the regulation. They've not exceeded the maximum duty. They've had a full regular rest. But if we look at this logically, with the requirement in mind that he must take his rest within the 24-hour period of starting work, 24 hours on from 7 o'clock that morning is, of course, 7 o'clock the next morning. So in legal terms, this driver's not had an 11-hour rest. He has actually had a 9-hour daily rest. And there is absolutely nothing the driver can do about it at this point. This driver could potentially go off on 2 weeks annual holiday at this point, but he has still had insufficient daily rest in the period starting at 7 a.m. on this day. So he could find himself coming back to a fixed penalty, summons, or other enforcement action. Okay? So if a driver works these shifts, he's really got to plan them from the start and think, if I'm finishing at 7, by 7 o'clock the next morning, I must have been able to get my full, in this case, regular daily rest in that period. And if he works backwards then from 7 o'clock the next morning, he will find he shouldn't have worked up until 10. He would have to come back to 8 o'clock. Okay? It'll be worth looking at multi-manning, because the rules around that are slightly different, and ferry crossings. Now with multi-manning, where there is more than one driver available in the vehicle to drive, the rules change completely, and we have a requirement for 9 hours rest in 30 hours. So we don't look at the 24-hour period any longer, we look at a 30-hour period. The two important things about this are that the driver can take a break on a moving vehicle. So while driver 1 is in the driving seat, driver 2 in the passenger seat, provided they're doing no work, they're not navigating or anything of that nature, they can count that period as a break. They can't, however, count it as a rest. For a rest, the vehicle must be stationary and the vehicle must be fitted with a bunk for both drivers. Okay? So 9 hours in 30-hour requirement. In terms of ferry crossings, we're normally talking international journeys, not exclusively, but normally we'd be talking international journeys, and there are quite different requirements there. The requirement in a ferry crossing is that a driver may interrupt a regular daily rest period to board and disembark from a ferry. We need to remember what a regular daily rest period is. And a regular daily rest period is 11 hours. We cannot interrupt a reduced daily rest period to board a ferry or train. If we do use this concession here, we're allowed to interrupt our rest period, our 11-hour rest period, twice, which allows us to get onto and get off the ferry or the train, and that interruption must be no more than 1 hour in total. Okay? So to give an example, our driver arrives at the port and it's 8 a.m. His ferry leaves the port at 9 a.m. He's had here 1 hour of his rest period. He interrupts that rest period there where he drives onto the ferry, and let's say it's a quick, easy drive onto the ferry, so it takes him 15 minutes. It's allowed by the regulations. He's then on board the ferry and he can continue his rest period then, and we'll imagine that the ferry crossing is 8 hours. So he's now taken a complete 9-hour rest period. But that, of course, only amounts to a reduced daily rest period, so would not qualify. But in any case, our driver has to disembark from the ferry. So he disembarks from the ferry here, and that takes him 40 minutes. By the time he's got off the boat, cleared customs, got off the port. He's only had 9 hours. He requires 11 to interrupt. So before he can drive off the port, he will now have to continue his rest period here for another 2 hours. So he has the 2 plus 8 plus 1, 11-hour daily rest period. Okay? He's interrupted the rest period twice, which is allowed by the regulation, and he's actually interrupted it by 55 minutes in total, which is below the hour that he's allowed to do so in that area. And that's the explanation of the ferry crossing. We said we'd come back to the Working Time Directive, and we're looking particularly at how the Working Time Directive affects a guy on multi-drop driving. That's the person who's going to be affected by this most. So the requirements under Working Time Directive are that if a person works for more than 6 hours, he or she has a break of 30 minutes. That break can be split into 2 15-minute periods. If the worker goes on to work for more than 9 hours, he or she needs an additional 15 minutes. And that's really the requirement that we need to concern ourselves with here. Now let's look at an example of a typical multi-drop worker. In fact, this isn't all that typical, but it's a simplified version of a multi-drop worker. So we come into work and we do other work for 2 hours. We then get into our truck and we actually drive for another 2 hours. Having reached our first destination, we then spend 2 hours offloading that particular load or part of the load. At this point here, there is no requirement to take a rest or a break under the EU regulations for driving time because we've only driven for 2 hours. But of course, we have worked for a total of 6 hours. So under Working Time Directive, if we intend to work on further past this point, we need to take our break at that point first.